when I started, like most people, I think, you start when you're a kid and when you're a child. Oh, I was very young. There are two periods in my life when I saw movies when I was very young, and it grabbed me. When I was about 5 or 6, living in Malaysia there's a place on the northeast by the sea, and they used to have this traveling cinema. It's just a couple of guys and a van and a truck, and they would put the cinema projector on top of the van, and then they tied to a piece of cloth, between two coconut trees, and going from village to village and small towns, and then and screen the film. And so for me, the first time I ever saw as a 5 or 6-year-old, I think, was Ben-Hur, and I was like, I still remember I was so taken by it. And many years later, of course, it was really a gradual thing because I moved to England and London, and then my father was working there. And so slowly I got into cinema and learned cinema in those days. I was already interested in arts and literature. Literature in many ways was my first love, and then painting. And then, moving into film wasn't really such a shift because I was already interested in images and all that. And then in London, there were hundreds in those days, 70s, lots of 70s, 80s, lots of secondhand bookshops. So I'd save my money and spend money on buying books, either literature, novels, or then when I discovered film, I started reading and buying books and criticisms on film. I was very young then, but I had already, in many ways, thought that's probably something I would like to do when I grew up, I thought, and the path has been a very circuitous one. It wasn't a direct path. And so that's how it really started. And I think at the time, you've got to remember, Michael, I mean, it was a time for me, we were talking to somebody else yesterday, it was really a time of one of the best era for culture, music, film, art, theatre, and growing up in an environment like that in London was superb. You could watch, and there was rap cinemas, you could watch Japanese cinema, cinema from India, cinema from Latin America, and cinema from everywhere in the world. And sometimes they would run for weeks in different times or different time slots of the day. And I would, I went to school, and near my school was this rap cinema or repertory cinema, and I would skip some classes during the day. It was getting boring, so I would go around the back of the school, at the back of the cinema, and then enter that way, and it's usually empty, except for a few old men, and I'd sit there and just watch all the French films, and then watch Spanish, and that's when I discovered Bunohan. I discovered and I started delving back into it, and it was so, when you discover something when you're young, it's very exciting, and it's very, and I remember that I think it's a lot, I would say, it's a lot of difference if you discover a novel or literature or a writer at 10 years old than if you discovered that same writer at 20 and you never heard of it. It's somehow a different kind of emotional and intellectual experience that you would have relating to the writer or the book or the story. Yeah. Yeah, I would say so, because I don't know where it came from, but I was already interested in the different areas. I mean, maybe it came from the fact that my mother was an English school teacher, even in Malaysia, so she taught English, and she was always just throwing books at me and leaving books for me to read. And that became a habit. She would leave us in the library and the whole of Saturday, and we'd go through books and then pick books we'd want for the week. And so that became, it was very much the staple diet from my childhood. And because of that, from literature, I moved to reading all kinds of things. And by the time I was 15, I was reading philosophy, and I was reading criticism. Criticism, like, really opened up my mind. People like Susan Sontag and all that. And I realized that I was interested because because when you discover something, you get really, really excited about something, and you just follow it and you pursue it. And I always had a book in each pocket. So when I'm in the underground station, I will be reading. I catch a train, I'll be reading. I'm so grateful for that. I don't think it was a conscious plan, but I think it was something that became out of habit. I'm so grateful to that childhood and to the fact that I had access to these things, and it was really wonderful. Yeah, I look back and I think I'm grateful because, and then when you start work, you just never have the time when you're working to go back to do those things. But it's almost as if I had prepared myself for these things. You know, all the great artists, there was so much at the time, exhibitions going on in London for art, exhibition from De Chirico to Picasso to Braque, and they would maybe this month there will be the Surrealist, the month after the Expressionist, aside from the traditional classical in the National Portrait Gallery and and the other galleries that was happening in London. And then don't forget, music was a burgeoning thing in the 70s. It wasn't just rock. It was rock, classical, mixed, and fusion. And then punk happened. And that just kind of like blew me away, yeah. Fassbinder, Herzog, and Wenders, and of course Schlondorf, was a constant in the repertory cinema, right? And so you could just go. I mean, there'd be a week of Fassbinder, there'll be a week of Herzog, and then from different cinemas who would be rotating. I remember the cinemas were Scala, the Everyman, and in Portobello Road, there was this thing called the Electric Cinema Club. And of course, they'd show old Russian films as well. And I was like, it was really an education for me. I'd spend days, and I had to do Latin in school because it was a very traditional school I went to. And I was thinking, how the hell am I going to use Latin? I regret it later because I bunked off Latin. I didn't go to Latin classes. And then later I realized when I got more and more into literature how useful that would have been because the Romance language, all based on, in many ways, Latin. And I think the structure and all that of German, because I wanted to do German, right? They didn't let me because you failed Latin. So I thought, oh, shit, so I had to do Spanish instead. But, my friends were into the French, other friends were into the Italians, but I discovered the new German cinema and fell in love with it. Aside from, to me, the trinity of Wenders, Herzog, and Fassbinder, it was also Hans-Jürgen Sieberberg, right? And I'd never seen cinema like this. If I can talk about Herzog first, when you see his films, particularly Agira, The Wrath of God, and later, of course, he went on, I saw the others, and later he went on to make Fitzcarraldo, and then Cobra Verde, which is based on, later I found out, on, what's his name, that famous English travel writer. And then I realized that years later, I was already taken, and there's two. Fassbinder I found also sometimes really hard-going because he's so cold and so distant, and it's really, for lack of a better word, he wore his intellectual heart on his sleeve. It's very kind of like, I don't know how to express it, distant and cold, and except for Fear Eats the Soul. And then I got more into it, especially from Veronica Voss onwards, to Lola, to Marlene Dietrich and all that. That, for me, was an eye-opener because he slowly expanded into it was more accessible for more people, I think, as opposed to, Berlin Alexanderplatz. I think he did that, if I'm not mistaken, and then all the other ones that he'd done. But what I was taken with was Herzog, and for specific reasons, Herzog and then Wenders. And Wenders, I started looking at it, and then when I started investigating more, I realized it's what my favorites, it's what he called dialectical cinema, because, and this is a very important thing for me. I remember it very, very vividly because, you know, I come from a third world developing nation. And the thing about the 70s and moving into the 80s, world cinema, if you are into world cinema, particularly from third world nations, like, you know, whether it's Africa, whether it's Asia or Latin America, there was always this idea of the cultural resistance and movement, resistance towards Hollywood in particular, you know, because of its dominance and hegemonic dominance. And so for a third world person, or for someone who I consider third world, that engagement, I saw Wim's and what he talks about and what he says in terms of how he defines dialectical cinema for him was precisely that relationship, but transplanted, but in a very Western context, because he was talking about, and that's how they declared the Oberhausen Manifesto, because they found that the so-called Marshall Plan, when the U.S. came in after the war, and to denazify all German cultural content, and so they flooded, or they put in American films into Germany, so much so that after a few generations, the new German cinema filmmakers found they did not have an audience, or it was difficult to engage with that audience who had been bred on American cinema for the last 2 to 3, I think they started in the 60s, you know, decades from the 40s. So it's like it had changed, in a way, the cinematic landscape. Now, you got to remember, for me, it's like I'd seen, when I was very young, Fritz Lang, Metropolis. I'd seen, I think, Ernst Lubitsch, I think he's German, right? And I'd seen the German expressionistic art, which then bled into cinema as well, you know? And so Murnau and all these people. And then you think, from that, and suddenly the new German cinema, and they were having problems finding an audience, right? The German audience were not necessarily into what they were doing. And I can understand that. Again, that's when he developed his idea of dialectical cinema. Germany already had a history in Hollywood. A lot of the German artists and filmmakers had moved to Hollywood, right? And so that's what he meant by dialectical. There was an engagement, so there was a dialogue. And that, he was lucky, because to me that was already ready-made. Whereas we, in the developing world, still needed to develop a cultural resistance towards Hollywood. You know what I mean? These are all old-fashioned terms today, I guess, you know. But at the time when I was young, I was very inspired by this idea. And Wim, in particular, took it, you know. Say, for example, Paris, Texas was based, really, he took Edward Hopper's paintings and the world that Edward Hopper built into his aesthetics in Paris, Texas, for example, yeah. And then his other films also was always engaging, like An American Friend. You could see that. Dennis Hopper was living in a, I can't remember which town, maybe Stuttgart, I can't remember, in Germany. And so there was that relationship between him and the characters within the film. And in many ways, Fassbinder also did that with Veronica, Fear Eats the Soul, right, which was really about a black GI soldier and falling in love with, I think he's black GI. Oh no, was he North African? Maybe he was North African. Maybe I got it wrong. Maybe it's Veronica Voss that had the black GI soldier. It's based on Sunset Boulevard, but instead of Sunset Boulevard was what, silent versus at the turn of when sound became really, really prevalent in American cinema, and therefore the sound actor from the silent era became really, it's about her demise and how she's trying to struggle. And Veronica Voss, I think he transplanted that into German versus US to a certain degree. It was a long time ago, so I may have got things mixed up. But anyway, so my point is, I take that and think that's the same kind of, in a way, dialectics going on between third third world and developing nation cinema and U.S. cinema. And I saw that in many ways as a framework, an intellectual framework within which I can understand. For me, I've always loved, of course, for lack of a better word, I hate these terms, but art house films, whether in particular for me, it was like the European tradition, Tarkovsky and Kieslowski, and that whole tradition that has been flourishing in Europe, to Bergman, and so on and so forth. But the thing is, for me, trying to make films in Malaysia, I really began slowly to explore and look into genre, because I think by that time, of course, when I started sometime in the 90s and thinking about when to start my first film and to work towards my first film into the 2000s, and I realized that essentially genre afforded a kind of language and accessibility to certain kinds of audiences. At the end of the day, it's all about context. You know what I'm saying? I mean, like, as an argument, there is no way, if I wanted to do something similar along Kieslowski's lines or Tarkovsky or Bela Tarr, no one's going to fund me. Do you know what I'm saying? And so it is still a developing nation, and it's still in many ways in its infancy in Malaysia. And even though, yes, Indonesia, for example, has managed to kind of carve out their own sense of aesthetics and language in cinema, but in Malaysia it's still very much so. Yes, I looked at genre and I thought, what, and develop a storyline within the framework of genre. Yeah. Mainly, I mean, there are people who deal with genre. Horror is the mainstay. Everyone, because I think it's also a cultural thing. People live with horror, with ghosts and spirits and so on and so forth. And I think that was readily accessible to me. I grew up with it. And so I that became something that I thought I could definitely work within my films. And then, but in Malaysia, generally there's, for a long time, there was a tendency to copy Hollywood, but not very good, very badly copied. And so I thought, why not me and Nandita, my producer, we thought, why don't we try and develop our own, not develop, but work on what we have and what we know and what we love in terms of story, and how the stories that we can, if you like, extract and dig from ourselves, from our own culture. And then you can put it within a framework, and that framework is really genre cinema. The Koreans, I believe, also do that. You can see they use genre, but at the same time, they really make it their own. Yeah, and I think that is something at some point we look to. We look to Korea and what they do, but of course we still keep up who we are as we are. When I spoke to Nandita, my producer, and said, I want to do this story, it's been fomenting in my head for a while. And so what I wanted to do was just build a family drama, but sat within that location of magic and superstitious beliefs, which is what exists. But at the same time, what I wanted to do was look at male violence and look at male relationships. And of course, I placed it within the family context. And so there are instances in Malaysia many times where the father may marry one woman and then marry another secretly, or, you know what I mean? So that became the complexity of how the two brothers are related, but one isn't, is from a different mother. And then the other two brothers, actually the mother, there is this tradition of dramaturgical healing. The healing is through, in a way, shamanistic practices. And we heard stories. I mean, I did research around there. I was speaking to people, and then there was one story which said the woman, the prima donna of that particular piece of work, this dramaturgical healing, became, in the middle of performance, became a white crocodile. And so I made the mother like half woman, half crocodile, in a way as an ode to nature, as an ode to the animist spirit of that world. And it was also, in a way, it was quite political. It's a kind of resistance towards a certain kind of religious conservatism that had got hold of that particular area of in the country. That's why. And then when I began to build on the characters, I built on the idea that there was an assassin, and it exists. I knew one, and then there was a kickboxer, the brother, and then there was a school teacher. Now, that school teacher in many ways exists, whether they're school teachers, businessmen, whatever. They work in a normal job, but behind and underneath that, it's extremely morally vile. And sometimes they're hooked into politics, so on and so forth. And that is the brother that's prepared to kill his entire family because of power and greed. Yeah, so that's how. So there is physical violence. There is violence because it's a sport that he works in. They both have jobs, and then there's a school teacher. To me, that's the most moral, most reprehensible because his is moral violence. Yeah, yeah. I think you hit it on the nail because in many ways, Bunohan, Interchange, and then there's another film that I did which wasn't ours, and then even in Harumalam, my latest, there's one thing that connects, which is really Southeast Asia, animism, the belief in spiritual, in the spirits and nature, and it rubs up again the so-called modernity of the 20th or 21st century, even in Southeast Asia. Glass buildings and infrastructure, it's all modern. But I love that, and I always wanted to, that is my world building, which is the contradictions between the two seemingly different worlds. And they are, but they somehow, in Southeast Asia, they blend, they work together. And we're not all, but I think in terms of the psychology of the characters and human nature, we're not that far off. It's just a line before it becomes either spirit, ghost, magic, and even animal, the raw stuff of humanity, of what it is being human. Yeah, yeah.